Chapter 2 of High Adventure, a narrative of air fighting in France, by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. High Adventure, a narrative of air fighting in France, by James Norman Hall. Chapter 2. Penguins. Having simple civilian notions as to the amount of time necessary for dressing, Drew and I rose with the sound of the bugle on the following morning. We had promised each other that we would begin our new life in true soldier style, and so we reluctantly hurried to the wash-house, where we shaved in cold water, washed after a fashion, and then hurried back to the unheated barrack-room. We felt refreshed, morally and physically. But our heroic example seemed to make no impression upon our fellow aviators, whether French or American. Indeed, not one of them stirred until 10 minutes before time for the morning appel, when there was a sudden upheaval of blankets down the entire length of the room. It was as though the patients in a hospital ward had been inoculated with some wonderful, instantaneous, health-giving virus. Men were jumping into boots and trousers at the same time, and running to and from the wash-house, buttoning their shirts and drying their faces as they ran. It must have taken months of experiment to perfect the system whereby every one remained in bed until the last possible moment. They professed to be very proud of it, but it was clear that they felt more at ease when Drew and I, after a week of heroic early morning resolves, abandoned our daily test of courage. We are all Dr. Johnsons at heart. It was a crisp, calm morning, an excellent day for flying. Already the mechanicians were bringing out the machines and lining them up in front of the hangars, in preparation for the morning work, which began immediately after appel. Drew and I had received notice that we were to begin our training at once. Solicitous fellow countrymen had warned us to take with us all our flying clothes. We were by no means to forget our goggles, and the fur-lined boots which are worn over ordinary boots as a protection against the cold. Innocently we obeyed all instructions to the letter. The absurdity of our appearance will be appreciated only by airmen. Novices begin their training at Blériot monoplane schools, in Penguins, low-powered machines with clipped wings, which are not capable of leaving the ground. We were dressed as we would have no occasion to be dressed until we should be making sustained flights at high altitudes. Everyone, Frenchman and American alike, had a good laugh at our expense, but it was one in which we joined right willingly, and one kind-hearted adjutant monsieur, in order to remove what discomfiture we may have felt, told us through an interpreter that he was sure we would become good airmen. Le très bon pilote could be distinguished in embryo by the way he wore his goggles. The beginners' class did not start work with the others, owing to the fact that the Penguins, driven by unaccustomed hands, covered a vast amount of ground in their rolling sorties back and forth across the field. Therefore Drew and I had leisure to watch the others, and to see in operation the entire scheme by means of which France trains her combat pilots for the front. Exclusive of the Penguin, there are 7 classes, graded according to their degree of advancement. These, in their order, were the rolling class, a second-stage Penguin class, in which one still kept on the ground, but in machines of higher speed; the first flying class, short hops across the field at an altitude of 2 to 3 metres; the second flying class, where one learned to mount to and from 30 to 50 metres, and to make landings without the use of the motor tour de poste. Flights about the aerodrome in a 45 horsepower Blériot tour de piste. Similar flights in a 50 horsepower machine, the spiral class and the brevet class. Our reception committee of the day before volunteered his services as guide, and took us from one class to another, making comments upon the nature of the work of each in a bewildering combination of English and Americanized French. I understood but little of his explanation, although later I was able to appreciate his French translation of some of our breezy Americanisms. But explanation was, for the most part, unnecessary. We could see for ourselves how the prospective pilot advanced from one class to another, becoming accustomed to machines of higher and higher power, growing his wings, very gradually until at last he reached the spiral glass, where he learned to make landings at a given spot and without the use of his motor, from an altitude of from 800 to 1,000 meters, losing height in volplanes and serpentines. The final test for the military brevet were 2 cross-country flights of from 200 to 300 kilometers, with landings during each flight at 3 points, 2 short voyages of 60 kilometers each, and an hour flight at a minimum altitude of 2,000 meters. With all the activities of the school taking place at once, we were as excited as 2 boys seeing their first 3-ring circus. We scarcely knew which way to turn in an anxiety to miss nothing. But my chief concern and anticipation had been this: how were English-speaking élèves pilotes to overcome the linguistic handicap? My uneasiness was set at rest on the first morning, when I saw how neatly most of the difficulties were overcome. Many of the Americans had no knowledge of French other than that which they had acquired since entering the French service, and this, as I have already hinted, had no great utilitarian value. An interpreter had been provided for them through the generosity and kindness of the Franco-American Committee in Paris, but it was impossible for him to be everywhere at once, and much was left to their own quickness of understanding and to the ingenuity of the moniteurs. The latter, being French, were eloquent with their gestures. With the additional aid of a few English phrases which they had acquired from the Americans, and the simplest kind of French, they had little difficulty in making their instructions clear. Both of us felt much encouraged as we listened, for we could understand them very well. As for the business of flying, as we watched it from below, it seemed the safest and simplest thing in the world. The machines left the ground so easily, and mounted and descended with such sureness of movement, that I was impatient to begin my training. I believed that I could fly at once, after a few minutes of preliminary instruction, without first going through with all the tedious rolling along the ground in low-powered machines. But before the morning's work was finished, I revised my opinion. Accidents began to happen. The first one, when one of the old family cuckoos, as the rolling machines were disdainfully called, showed a sudden burst of old-time speed, and left the ground in an alarming manner. It was evident that the man who was driving it, taken completely by surprise, had lost his head, and was working the controls erratically. First he swooped upward, then dived, tipping dangerously on one wing. In this sudden emergency he had quite forgotten his newly acquired knowledge. I wondered what I would do in such a strait, when one must think with the quickness and sureness of instinct. My heart was in my mouth, for I felt certain that the man would be killed. As for the others who were watching, no one appeared to be excited. A moniteur near me said, "Oh la la, est perdu," in a mild voice. The whole affair happened so quickly that I was not able to think myself into a similar situation before the end had come. At the last, the machine made a quick swoop downward from a height of about 50 meters, then careened upward, tipped again, and, diving sideways, struck the ground with a sickening, rending crash, the motor going at full speed. For a moment it stood, tail in the air. Then slowly the balance was lost, and it fell, bottom up, and lay silent. An enterprising moving picture company would have given a great deal of money to film that accident. It would have provided a splendid dramatic climax to a war drama of high adventure. Civilian audiences would have watched in breathless, awestruck silence. But at a military school of aviation it was a different matter. "Oh la la, il est perdu," adequately gauges the degree of emotional interest taken in the incident. At the time I was surprised at this apparent callousness, but I understood it better when I had seen scores of such accidents occur, and had watched the pilots, as in this case, crawl out from the wreckage and walk sheepishly, and a little shaken, back to their classes. Although the machines were usually badly wrecked, the pilots were rarely severely hurt. The landing chassis of a Blériot is so strong that it will break the force of a very heavy fall, and the motor, being in front, strikes the ground first, instead of pinning the pilot beneath it. To anticipate a little, in more than 4 months of training at the Blériot school, there was not a single fatality. although as many as 11 machines were wrecked in the course of 1